There is a coastline drawn on a 500-year-old map that should not exist. It shows the northern edge of Antarctica. Every bay, every river mouth, every inlet traced in ink, and it shows that coast with no ice on it at all. Bare rock, open shoreline. The problem is simple. Antarctica was not discovered until 1820. Its true coastline, the shape of the actual land underneath the ice, was not measured until 1949, when a Swedish-British expedition dragged seismic gear across the continent and bounced sound off the bedrock a mile beneath their feet. That survey matched the map. A map drawn in 1513. Somebody charted the land under the ice more than 4 centuries before we had the technology to see it. And they drew it the way it looks, with the ice stripped away. The map is real. It sits in a museum in Istanbul. It was drawn by an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis, who wrote in the margins that he had copied it from older charts, some of them ancient, sources he did not name and we have never found. Most people glance at it and see an old map of the Atlantic, but hidden along the bottom edge is something that shouldn't be there. A stretch of coast that only makes sense if someone stood on a warm, green Antarctica and wrote down what they saw. That is the promise of this investigation. And by the end of it, you are going to see 3 separate pieces of evidence that point at the same impossible conclusion. A map that shows the wrong world. A theory that a man too famous to ignore signed his name to. And a discovery 2 miles under the ice that nobody has been allowed to fully open. Start with the map. For decades, scholars dismissed the southern coastline on the Piri Reis map as a mistake, a copying error. They said Piri Reis ran out of room on his sheet of gazelle hide and bent the tip of South America sideways to make it fit, and that the bent coast just happens to look like Antarctica. That is the mainstream answer, and it is a reasonable one. But that explanation has a problem. In 1960, a U.S. Air Force cartographer named Harold Ohlmeyer was asked to examine the lower section of the map. He was not a fringe theorist. He ran a technical charting unit, and his written conclusion in an official letter was that the geography in the lower part of the map agreed remarkably with the seismic profile of the coast taken by the 1949 expedition. The survey done through a mile of ice. He wrote that the coastline appeared to have been mapped before the ice covered it. An Air Force officer, looking at a 1513 map, concluded in writing that it depicted Antarctica as it was before it froze. Not a myth, not a metaphor, a signed technical assessment sitting in the record. Here is where it gets stranger. The Piri Reis map is not the only one. A French mathematician named Oronce Finet drew a world map in 1531 that also shows a southern continent in roughly the right place, with rivers and mountain ranges in its interior, features you would only draw if the land were not buried under 2 miles of ice. 2 maps, different map makers, different countries, both showing a continent nobody would officially see for another 300 years, and both showing it green. And here is the detail that turns the word green from a figure of speech into a fact. Antarctica was green. Not recently, but it was. Fossil evidence pulled from the continent shows that around 53 million years ago, Antarctica was a forested wilderness, warm enough that palm trees took root there. A land of rivers and forest sat where the ice sheet now sits. Nobody disputes that. The only fight is over the date. Science says the forests died and the ice came tens of millions of years ago, long before any human could have stood on that shore. The maps say something walked that coast and wrote it down. Those 2 claims cannot both be right, and the gap between them is where this whole mystery lives. The mainstream position is that these are coincidences, distortions, and the old European habit of sketching an imaginary terra australis at the bottom of every chart. And some of that is fair. Mapmakers did invent southern lands. But an invented land does not match a seismic survey of the real bedrock. A guess does not line up with the ground truth measured by sound in 1949. So the question stops being whether these maps are odd and becomes something heavier. Where did the source charts come from? Because Piri Reis told us himself that he copied them. He was not the original cartographer. He was the last person to hold a copy of something much older. If you want to know what the source maps were and what happened to the people who made them, subscribe now, because this channel follows the sealed sites and the drowned coastlines every week. And this trail is only getting colder and deeper, because the map is just the first clue. The second is a theory, and the man who put his name to it is the reason you cannot laugh this off. His name was Charles Hapgood, and he was not a mystic. He was a Harvard-educated history professor who had worked in wartime intelligence, a liaison between the White House and the War Department. In 1966, he published a book arguing that the ancient source maps behind Piri Reis and Oronche Finne were the fingerprints of a lost civilization that had mapped the whole planet during the last ice age, including an Antarctica that was not yet frozen. And to explain how a continent could be green and then buried under a mile of ice, he proposed something radical. He called it Earth crustal displacement. The idea is that the entire outer shell of the planet, the crust, can slip as a single piece over the softer layer beneath it. Not continents drifting apart slowly over millions of years. The whole rigid skin of the Earth sliding at once, dragging a temperate landmass down into the polar zone in a geological instant. Hapgood put a date on it. Around 9,600 BCE, roughly 11,600 years ago. That date should stop you, because 9,600 BCE is the exact date Plato gave thousands of years earlier, for the sinking of Atlantis. Plato wrote that the great island vanished 9,000 years before the time of the lawmaker Solon, and when you add the centuries back, the number lands on 9,600 BCE. Plato said Atlantis lay beyond the Pillars of Heracles, out past the known world, in the ocean. He said it was an island larger than Libya and Asia combined, a continent-sized land. He described its capital ringed by alternating bands of water and land, concentric circles cut into the earth, and walls sheathed in metal, one of them gleaming with orichalcum, a red metal that shone like fire. He said it was swallowed in a single day and night of misfortune. For 2,000 years, people searched the Mediterranean and the Atlantic for it. But a land larger than Libya and Asia, beyond the edge of the known world, that vanished from human sight in one catastrophe 11,500 years ago. There is a land mass that fits every one of those words. It is the size of a continent. It is beyond every ancient horizon. And it did vanish under ice in an eye blink of geological time. It is at the bottom of the map. And there is one more detail Plato gave that people treat as decoration. Those concentric rings of water and land around the capital. For centuries, readers pictured a fairy tale city of moats. But rings of alternating water and rock are not fantasy. They are what you get from a natural geological dome that has been carved by erosion into circular ridges, or from an ice-carved basin ringed by meltwater. Plato may not have been describing architecture. He may have been describing terrain, the actual shape of a place, recorded by someone who stood in it and did not have the words for what made it. Reframe the myth as a description, and it stops sounding invented. It starts sounding remembered. Now, the mainstream response to Hapgood is blunt, and it deserves a fair hearing. Geologists say crustal displacement, the whole crust sliding at once, is not physically supported. Plate tectonics moves continents at the speed your fingernails grow, not fast enough to freeze a civilization. Paleoclimate cores drilled from the Antarctic ice sheet show that ice has covered that land not for thousands of years, but for millions. On the standard timeline, there was no green Antarctica for anyone to map 11,600 years ago, because the ice was already ancient. That is the wall this theory runs into. And it is a real wall, Even Albert Einstein, who found Hapgood's idea interesting enough to write a foreword for one of his books, was intrigued by the mechanism, not convinced of the history. So we have a theory that predicts a warm Antarctica and ice cores that say it was frozen the whole time. Two facts that cannot both be true. And that is exactly where the third clue comes in. Because in the last 30 years, we have finally started to see what is actually under the ice. And it is not what anyone drew on a chart or wrote in a book. It is stranger than both. Under the Antarctic ice, there is a mountain range the size of the Alps. Peaks nearly 9,000 feet high, sharp and utterly hidden. They are called the Gamburtsev Mountains. We know they exist only because seismic and radar surveys detected them starting in 1958. No human eye has ever seen them. No sunlight has touched them in tens of millions of years. And here is the part that unsettles geologists. Those peaks are sharp, jagged, alpine. Mountains that old should be worn down to stumps by erosion, the way ancient ranges everywhere else on Earth are ground flat by time. Instead, they look young, their shape preserved because the ice froze over them like a cast and stopped the clock. Whatever the surface of that land looked like when the ice came, it is still down there, frozen exactly as it was. And it is not empty rock. Beneath that ice, we have now mapped more than 400 lakes. Liquid water, sealed under miles of frozen ice, kept warm from below by the heat of the Earth. The largest is Lake Vostok, a body of water the size of Lake Ontario, buried under nearly 2.5 miles of ice, cut off from the sky for something like 15 million years. It is deep, more than 800 meters in places, big enough to have its own internal currents and tides. In February 2012, a Russian drill team finally punched through to it, after drilling down through more than 3,700 meters of ancient ice, layer after layer of frozen time. When the bit broke the seal, the pressure was so violent that lake water shot up the borehole like a geyser and froze before anyone could get an instrument down to it. They sampled the frozen plug the next year. It was not sterile. It carried DNA fragments from thousands of kinds of organisms, some closest to bacteria, some to fungi, some to species that live in the sea, all of it evolving in total darkness in a hidden world nobody knew was habitable. A living sea, under the ice, sealed since before our species existed. Now, does any of this prove Plato's Atlantis is frozen at the South Pole? Probably not, and you should be suspicious of anyone who tells you it is certain. The hard science cuts against the extreme version. The ice cores really do say the ice is millions of years old. Crustal displacement, the sudden slide, is not a mechanism working geologists accept. The Piri Reis coastline can be explained as a bent copy of South America, and the sharpest overlays that make it look like Queen Maudland can be accused of nudging the scale to fit. Every single clue, taken alone, has an ordinary answer. That is true, and it matters. But here is what the ordinary story still cannot do. It cannot explain how a coastline traced in 1513 lines up with a seismic survey of buried bedrock taken in 1949 well enough that an Air Force cartographer put his conclusion in writing. It cannot explain why two independent mapmakers, decades apart, both drew a green southern continent with rivers in its interior, centuries before anyone sailed south far enough to see ice, let alone land. And it cannot explain the coincidence at the center of all of it, that a professor calculating a global catastrophe from old maps and a Greek philosopher recording a drowned world from Egyptian priests landed on the same date, 9,600 BCE, from completely different directions. They were not comparing notes. One was reading stone tablets in Egypt. The other was reading Ice Age cartography at Harvard. And they arrived at the same year. Even the grounded version of this is extraordinary. Strip away Atlantis entirely, and you are still left with source maps, admitted copies of older charts that show geography no one in the 1500s had any way to know. At minimum, somebody, somewhere, once possessed a map of the world more complete than the one the great sea powers of Europe were using. That knowledge existed, it was copied, and then it was lost so completely that we spent 500 years arguing about whether it was a mistake. And the land itself is still down there, exactly as the ice found it. Sharp mountains that have never seen the sun. 400 hidden lakes carrying DNA from a world sealed off before history began. A borehole into Vostok that spat its water back rather than let us look. We have drilled 2 miles into it and pulled up life we did not expect, and then, mostly, we stopped. The continent under the ice has been surveyed by sound and radar, but the thing the old maps insist was there. A coast where people once stood has never been dug for, because officially, there is nothing to dig for. Tonight, while the world sleeps, Antarctica does what it has done for longer than we can prove. It sits in the dark at the bottom of the planet, holding its mountains and its buried seas and whatever else is frozen in the rock beneath, under a wall of ice a mile thick that we have barely scratched. The maps are still in their museums. The date still matches. And the coastline someone drew before the ice, the one that should not exist, is still down there waiting under the white for the first camera that gets to see it. If you want to know what else the ancient world charted and then lost, watch the next investigation on screen right now.